The forest was a cathedral of silence, its towering pines stretching endlessly toward a dull, bruised sky. The last threads of sunlight bled through the canopy, scattering over damp moss and forgotten paths that hadn't known human steps in years. A strange heaviness clung to the air, the kind that made the chest tighten and the pulse quicken without cause. Then came the first sound, deep, deliberate, impossibly heavy, echoing from somewhere behind the line of black trees. It wasn't the shuffle of a bear or the crash of wind. It was slower, more knowing. The sound paused, as if listening for movement, and in that fragile silence between beats, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, and something else, musky, primal, and wrong. When the next step came, closer this time, the woods answered with a whisper that was almost a voice. The campsite was a mess of shredded nylon and trampled earth, as though a storm had ripped through. But no storm could leave prints like those pressed deep into the mud. The air buzzed with a low hum, a vibration just beneath hearing, unsettling in its persistence. The remnants of a campfire smoldered faintly, sending up ribbons of smoke that twisted into strange shapes before dissolving. There was no sign of struggle, no bodies, only the echo of sudden flight. A lantern flickered weakly beside a torn sleeping bag, its light trembling like a heartbeat in the dark. Then came that same smell again. Wet fur, blood, decay, and it felt as though the forest itself was leaning closer to listen. Somewhere in the black beyond the clearing, something shifted. The whisper returned, too faint to understand, too close to ignore. Water streamed gently between smooth stones, its murmur barely masking the sound of the forest breathing. Along the edge of the creek, a line of footprints sank deep into the silt, each one enormous, wider than a human torso, pressed with impossible weight. They led upstream, disappearing into fog that moved unnaturally against the wind. The tracks carried a strange symmetry, too precise for an animal, yet too monstrous for reason. As the last rays of light dissolved into silver dusk, the water trembled, breaking its mirror surface. Something vast moved beneath it. Just once, and then was gone, leaving only concentric ripples and silence that felt alive. The forest waited, the trees holding their dark secrets in the hush between heartbeats. The hollow tree stood like a wound in the forest, its interior blacker than night. The bark around the opening was splintered, shredded as if torn by claws. Inside, the stench of rot and something older crept out, metallic and fetid. A flashlight beam swept across the hollow and caught glimpses of strange objects, bones arranged deliberately, bits of cloth tangled in branches, something glinting wetly in the dark. The deeper the light probed, the more the air seemed to pulse, vibrating like a held breath on the verge of breaking. Then, from within that void came a soft, guttural sound. A syllable, maybe a word, repeated slowly with the rhythm of a heart. The fire burned low, its embers casting restless shapes against the trunks. Each spark that rose seemed to die in midair, swallowed by an unseen weight pressing down from the dark. Then, through the wavering haze of smoke, a figure appeared beyond the fire's reach. Tall, impossibly still, its eyes catching the light like two cold mirrors. It didn't move, didn't breathe, yet the shadows bent toward it, drawn like threads of silk, pulled by an unseen hand. The silence stretched, elastic and unbearable, until the figure tilted its head, ever so slightly, as though curious. The next moment, the fire guttered and went out, leaving nothing but the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing in the blackness. The storm broke over the ridge like a slow collapse, rain threading through the canopy in endless silver lines. The world dimmed to a shifting blur of gray and green, every shadow alive with motion. The flashlight's beam faltered, eaten by the thick mist that clung to the undergrowth. Each step through the sodden earth brought the faint echo of pursuit. A distant crack of branches, a wet, dragging rhythm that refused to fade. The air felt charged, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to occur. Then, in a brief flash of lightning, the trees revealed shapes, more than one, tall and rigid, unmoving yet watching. When the light died, so did the illusion of safety. The forest became a cage of rain and sound, every heartbeat a signal to something vast that was closing in. Dawn came reluctantly, a dim gray bruise on the horizon. The forest floor was littered with shredded leaves and fragments of something that glistened faintly in the cold light. A thin trail of blood wound through the brush, too deliberate to be from an animal, as if something had been dragged but never struggled. The trees leaned inward, their trunks black and wet, guiding the path deeper into silence. Each step followed a growing certainty. Something was not only hunting but herding, forcing movement toward a place it had chosen. The sound of dripping water mingled with faint, rhythmic thuds, like slow breathing through the roots. The scent of iron thickened. When the trail ended abruptly beside a shallow hollow, the earth seemed to tremble from within. Silence returned, but it wasn't peace. It was surveillance. The forest was still except for the whisper of wind against bark. Between the trees, movement flickered. A slow, deliberate shift just beyond focus. The feeling of being watched thickened the air, pressing against skin like static before lightning. Every direction looked the same, a repetition of trunks and fog. But in the corner of sight, something swayed. It was too tall, too wide, its motions oddly fluid, like the forest itself was breathing through it. The moment the gaze tried to fix on it, it vanished. Then came the low rumble, half growl, half exhale. From behind, the trees shivered, shedding droplets like cold sweat, and the echo of that sound seemed to crawl beneath the ground. By the time the forest opened into the clearing, the light had dimmed again, filtered through smoke-colored clouds. The air was thick with flies and the stench of old death. Scattered bones carpeted the ground. Some cracked, some sharpened into points, all arranged in spirals that drew inward toward a mound of earth. The pattern wasn't random. It spoke of ritual, of intent. Among the bones lay remnants of tools, scraps of torn clothing, a broken lens, and something larger half buried beneath the soil. As the first crow landed atop the mound, its call echoed strangely, hollow. The trees bordering the clearing swayed, though no wind moved them, and a shadow lengthened across the bone spiral, stretching toward the center like an invitation. Dusk fell early, swallowed by a thick fog that glowed faintly orange where the sun died. The air carried that sound again, the deep, chest-rattling thump of footsteps measured and slow. The trees seemed to bend away from the source, creaking as though in pain. Then it emerged through the haze, taller than any living thing had the right to be, its outline broken and uneven, fur slicked with rain and shadow. Its eyes caught what little light remained, reflecting it in dull amber flashes that pulsed with each breath. It paused, head tilting, the air vibrating with a growl that was almost human. The forest froze. Even the wind dared not move. Then it stepped forward once, and the ground shuddered as though the mountain itself exhaled. The night pressed close, heavy and wet, the rain now a fine mist that hung in the air like breath. The forest floor had changed. It no longer felt like earth, but something softer, pulsing faintly beneath the boots. Each step sent vibrations outward, as though walking on the skin of something vast and living. The whispers came again, low and indistinct, threading through the branches, curling around every thought. They weren't coming from behind anymore. They were beneath, inside, layered over the rhythm of a heartbeat not one's own. The trees seemed to close in, their trunks bending inward with grotesque familiarity, bark bulging in shapes that might have once been faces. The air thickened until breathing felt like swallowing smoke, and every whisper carried the same message, repeated endlessly. Don't look up. Lightning revealed the mark. A spiraled symbol carved deep into the trunk, glistening with something darker than sap. Around it, the bark had hardened and cracked, as though resisting what had been burned inside. Every few seconds, the mark seemed to shimmer, faintly pulsing in rhythm with that distant, impossible breathing. Touching it sent a vibration up the arm, not pain but memory. Flashes of firelight, bones arranged in the same spiral, a low chanting from unseen mouths. The forest swayed with the memory, trees bending closer, whispering that same cadence. The mark was a warning, or maybe a summons. The rain hissed against the wound in the tree, but the mark did not fade. It grew brighter, the pulse now echoing with a sound too deep to be human. The forest began to strobe with erratic flashes of lightning, each burst freezing fragments of motion between the trees. The figure appeared only in those fractions, once crouched low, once hanging from a branch, once standing impossibly close. Every flash redrew its body, its proportions shifting, the shape of its head elongating, the limbs rearranging into configurations that shouldn't have existed. The smell of ozone thickened, mixing with rot, until the air burned in the lungs. Time fractured in the gaps between flashes. Moments bled together, and sound slowed to a drawn-out hum. When the lightning stopped, the world held still, and in that unbroken dark, the next breath came from just behind, long and deliberate, like something mimicking the rhythm of human fear. From within the hollow of a fallen oak came a voice, soft, broken, and pleading. It spoke in fragments, as though each word cost something to form. The sound was unmistakably human, yet carried an undertone too deep, too resonant. The rain muffled everything except that voice calling out from the black mouth of the tree. Each repetition grew weaker, as if being pulled backward, swallowed by something inside. Then, faintly, the sound changed. Two voices now, overlapping, echoing each other's words. One cried for help. The other repeated the same words, but slower, distorted, the syllables drawn out into growls. The hollow trembled with vibration. When the voice stopped, the silence it left behind seemed to move, as though the absence itself had weight. By the stream, the water ran dark, reflecting only the gray blur of clouds. Leaning over it revealed not a face, but a shadow, a figure standing on the opposite bank, perfectly still. Yet, when the reflection shifted, the figure did not. Its eyes were pale and distant, glimmering faintly beneath the surface, as if the stream were a window, not a mirror. Then the reflection blinked once and began to move independently, lips parting as though whispering through the current. The surface rippled, and another face began to form beside it, followed by a third, each emerging with mouths open in silent screams. The sound that came next was not heard but felt, a vibration that shook the water and sent ripples crawling up the shore like cold fingers. The forest had gone deathly still, every sound swallowed by a hush that felt deliberate. The air was dense, thick with anticipation, and the distant metallic scent of rain that had yet to fall. Somewhere deep between the trees came the faint rhythm of movement, steady, pacing, patient. It wasn't close, but it never drifted far. Circling just out of sight, the ground seemed to absorb every footstep, every breath, until the silence became unbearable. Then a low crack split the stillness, followed by the soft percussion of running. Fast, 4-beat, impossibly smooth. The chase had begun before realization could take root, and the forest responded with a frenzy of sound. Snapping branches, beating wings, the echo of a growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. Branches exploded from the trees as something vast tore through the undergrowth. Splinters rained down like shrapnel, slicing through the mist. The path ahead curved sharply, narrowing into a tunnel of leaning pines that seemed to close in with each heartbeat. The air roared with movement, breathing, snarling, the grinding scrape of bark under claws. Lightning flashed through the canopy, revealing streaks of fur slick with rain and something glistening red. The world became a blur of motion. every step driven by the instinct to flee. Behind, the rhythm of pursuit changed, no longer running but walking again. Slow, confident, mocking. The forest's breath came in gusts, and the rain began to fall like applause from something unseen above. The sound of pursuit faded, replaced by a strange, rhythmic tapping echoing through the pines. Each tap reverberated with the hollow resonance of wood struck by stone. The forest stretched unnaturally long, each tree looking identical to the last, the distance warping with every turn. Then the tapping changed. No longer a rhythm, but a code. 3 slow knocks. Silence. 2 quick ones. It repeated, growing closer, until the trees themselves began to shake. The realization came like a cold current through the spine. The sound wasn't from wood being struck. It was from inside the trunks. The tapping became pounding. Dozens of impacts at once, the forest vibrating like a drum. Then, all at once, the noise stopped, leaving a ringing emptiness in its wake. The rain came harder, drumming against leaves and drowning all sound except for the hiss of water on mud. But through the downpour, a pattern emerged, flashes of light, not from lightning, but reflection. Pairs of eyes, hundreds of them, glinting faintly through the gloom, watching from the trees. They did not blink. They did not move. The forest floor crawled with movement, the undergrowth trembling as unseen shapes shifted in rhythm with each flash. The smell of decay and fur mixed with the cold bite of the storm. Then one pair of eyes broke the stillness, stepping forward into the half-light. Its shape was clearer now, towering, skeletal in posture, fur hanging like tattered cloth, a mouth stretching too wide for silence. It raised its head, and the eyes behind it vanished all at once. The storm tore the canopy open, revealing a sickly yellow sky above, pulsing faintly like an infected wound. The rain slowed, leaving a suffocating steam that rose from the earth. In the clearing, broken branches and uprooted trees lay twisted in strange, deliberate spirals. At the center of it stood the creature, its breath fogging the air in heavy bursts. The ground trembled with each exhale. It turned slowly, scanning the clearing as though waiting for something unseen to arrive. Then, impossibly, another shape stepped from the mist, similar but smaller, leaner. Its eyes a deep, liquid red. They faced each other in silence. The forest held its breath. And then, in perfect unison, both lifted their heads and roared. A sound that split the sky and sent birds falling dead from the air. Darkness reclaimed the forest, swallowing every trace of sky. The fog rolled in thick, heavy, almost solid, clinging to the skin like a living thing. It crept low, tendrils curling around roots and stones, moving against the wind as though guided by intent. The trees stood silent, their outlines fading into the milky haze, until only the faint drip of condensation broke the quiet. Then came the first scream. Muffled, distant, dissolving into the fog before reaching its end. The mist responded, pulsing outward as if feeding on the sound. Shapes began to move within it, tall, indistinct, swaying in rhythm with the whispers that echoed just below hearing. Each whisper formed a single word, repeated over and over, the syllables wet and guttural. Stay. The lantern's glow carved a trembling circle into the mist, a fragile boundary between light and the living dark. Beyond it, nothing existed, only the faint glimmer of wet eyes that blinked out when the beam touched them. Inside the circle, the ground was littered with bones and soaked leaves that shone like oil in the shifting light. The fog pressed closer, the boundary shrinking as if the air itself were being consumed. Then, without warning, the lantern flickered. The light dimmed, surged, and dimmed again, each pulse revealing new shapes at the edge of vision. Figures crouched low, limbs too long, faces hidden behind curtains of hair and shadow. They waited, unmoving, until the final flicker came. The light went out and the circle became a trap of breathing darkness. The first crack of splintering wood echoed through the fog like thunder. It came from everywhere and nowhere, each sound followed by the groan of trees tearing at their roots. The forest was moving, folding inward, the trunks bending as if drawn toward a center. The ground heaved, soil splitting to reveal slick veins of black water beneath. The air grew hot, reeking of iron and sap. Then something immense moved through the haze, its outline shifting like smoke, brushing against trees that shattered on contact. The sound of bones breaking followed, wet and deliberate. It didn't hunt anymore, it gathered. And as the cracking grew louder, the realization came: the forest itself was being consumed, absorbed into the thing that had always lived within it. The fog thinned suddenly, revealing a distant glow. Red, flickering, alive. The horizon burned as though the sky itself had split open. Through the haze, the outline of the ridge appeared, a jagged silhouette against the unnatural light. The forest between here and there was unrecognizable. Trunks melted into one another, the ground slick and pulsing, rivers of mud carrying fragments of bone downstream. Above, the stars had vanished, replaced by a swirling vortex of crimson cloud that rotated silently, pulsing with every breath of the thing below. In the glow, figures moved, dozens of them, emerging from the tree line, their skin glistening, eyes reflecting the same blood-red hue. They walked upright but wrong, swaying, their heads tilting toward the light like worshippers awaiting communion. At the heart of the forest stood the clearing once more, transformed into a pit of red light and writhing shapes. The air pulsed with low-frequency vibrations that shook the ribs, a rhythm older than language. Around the spirals of bone, the creatures gathered, their movements synchronized with the thunder of unseen drums. The central mound quivered, splitting open like flesh under pressure, revealing an abyss glowing from within. A roar rose from its depths, so deep it made the trees bend backward. And the fog turned black, coiling upward like smoke. The creatures fell to their knees, heads tilted back, as something colossal began to emerge. The light dimmed, and for one infinite moment, the forest was silent. Then came the sound of feeding. Morning never came. The world had become a smoldering dusk, the air thick with floating ash that fell like gray snow. The forest above was gone, reduced to blackened stumps and smoking roots, but below, the ground still breathed. A narrow fissure yawned open where the clearing had been, pulsing with faint red light that drew downward, like a wound leading into the heart of the mountain. Each step into the fissure carried the echo of 1,000 faint whispers, merging into a single voice that seemed to hum inside the skull. The walls dripped with moisture and something darker, and the deeper the descent, the warmer the air became. Wet, metallic, suffocating. Somewhere ahead a rhythmic thudding began, deep and constant like the heartbeat of something vast that waited far beneath the earth. The passage widened into a chamber so vast that the walls were lost in shadow. Massive roots hung from the ceiling like veins, each pulsing faintly with red luminescence. The ground was soft, almost flesh-like, giving slightly underfoot with each step. From within the walls came slow, heavy breaths, exhalations of damp air that smelled of soil and decay. Embedded in the roots were remnants of the forest above, branches, stones, the bones of creatures long buried, all fused together as though the mountain had been feeding for centuries. The hum grew louder, layered now with the sound of dripping liquid that fell rhythmically into unseen pools. The air itself seemed to whisper, not in words, but intent. A murmur that promised revelation at the cost of reason. Deeper still, the walls began to change. The rock gave way to something smoother, pale and wet, shaped into bulging forms that looked disturbingly human. Dozens, then hundreds, of faces pressed against the surface, their mouths open in eternal screams that made no sound. Eyes fluttered beneath translucent membranes, rolling blindly toward movement. The whispering intensified, each voice distinct now, crying out in languages long forgotten. Some of the faces wept thick, dark fluid that dripped into rivulets along the ground. As the lantern flickered, one of the mouths twitched, then spoke faintly, in a tone that was almost gentle. The words were impossible to understand, but their meaning was felt deep in the bones. It remembers you. The wall exhaled, and the tunnel pulsed with heat. At the chamber's core, a river of molten light cut through the floor, glowing with an energy that wasn't heat but life. The roots dipped into it, drinking greedily, their veins pulsing brighter with every second. The air shimmered with distortion, filled with the scent of burning copper. Above the river, shapes moved within the light, figures twisting, merging, breaking apart, their outlines human for moments before dissolving into fluid flame. A low moan reverberated through the cavern, rising in pitch until it became indistinguishable from the hum of the mountain itself. The light pulsed once, then dimmed. In the sudden dark, the realization struck like ice. The thing beneath the mountain wasn't trapped. It was waking. The ground convulsed. A deep roar tore through the cavern, shaking the walls and sending cascades of dust from the unseen ceiling. The roots writhed like serpents, tearing free and flailing wildly as if in pain. From the center of the molten river rose a shape, formless at first, then solidifying, enormous and skeletal, its surface glistening with black fluid. The air grew so hot it burned to breathe. It opened its maw and released a sound that wasn't a scream, but a memory. A sound older than language, older than life. The cavern lights dimmed to darkness except for its eyes. Two glowing coals of living fire, and in that instant it became clear. The forest above had never been haunted by a creature. It had been the creature, and this was its heart finally beating again. The mountain screamed as it began to tear itself apart. The walls split in violent bursts, spilling molten light into every crevice. Roots snapped like tendons, spraying steam and blood-dark sap across the chamber. The colossal thing at the core howled, a sound so vast it shook memory itself, erasing thought. The air ignited, not with fire but pure force, throwing everything upward through a storm of stone and heat. The fissure above yawned wider, vomiting red light into the dead forest above. The earth convulsed, swallowing trees, bones, and centuries of silence in one unending roar. The last sight before the ascent was the creature sinking back into the molten river, not defeated, but waiting, its burning eyes following upward until the light consumed them both. The surface was unrecognizable, a plain of ash and smoke stretching where forest once stood. The air shimmered with heat, the horizon blurred and trembling. Trees stood like skeletal fingers, their bark burned white. Each gust of wind carried flakes of charred leaves that disintegrated on contact. The silence was worse than the noise below. It was the silence of something finished, emptied of life. The ground trembled faintly beneath the feet, the pulse of the mountain still beating, faint but steady. Then from the distance the fog returned, not gray this time, but black, rising in twisting columns that took the shape of limbs and faces before collapsing again. The forest was gone, but it was not dead. It was changing, reforming in the creature's image. Through the wasteland, faint shapes began to appear, objects half buried in ash, fragments of tents, a melted flashlight, a boot still laced, a compass cracked down its center. Each object emitted a low hum, faint but rhythmic, like the echoes of lives remembered by the earth itself. The hum synchronized with the mountain's pulse, growing louder with each step. The air shimmered as heat gave way to a deeper vibration, distorting the world around it. Shadows lengthened, stretching unnaturally far, bending toward the mountain as though drawn back into its gravity. The path ended abruptly at a pool of still water, black as tar, mirror flat. The reflection showed not the scorched wasteland, but the forest as it had been, green and alive, swaying gently, in silent mockery. The wind shifted. From the pool rose a ripple that spread outward, slow and deliberate, though no hand disturbed it. The reflection shimmered, and faint sounds of birdsong drifted upward, impossible in this dead world. Then came a single exhale, deep and resonant, rolling through the ash like thunder. The black fog recoiled as if in recognition. The pool began to boil, steam rising in thick, roiling plumes. Within it, shapes took form. Trees, limbs, faces, all merging and dissolving in a grotesque dance of rebirth. The mountain pulsed once, and the reflection's forest caught fire, burning in silence. When the steam cleared, the pool was empty, leaving only the faint scent of pine and something old, returning to the air. Something that had never left, only waited. Night fell once more, swift and unnatural, draping the ruined forest in dense smoke that shimmered faintly with internal light. From within it, tall shapes began to move again. Familiar, yet multiplied. Their eyes glowed like distant embers, scattered across the darkness in hundreds, then thousands. They stood silently along the ridge, their forms blending into the smoke, as though the mountain had breathed them out one by one. The wind carried their scent, earth, rain, and blood, along with a low, mournful sound like chanting carried from underground. The horizon pulsed faintly red, mirroring the mountain's slow heartbeat. And then, as one, the figures turned their heads toward the viewer. The forest breathed in again, reclaiming the air. The story was not ending. It was beginning again.